The usual crowd of tourists had thinned, leaving behind an almost ethereal calm around the historic grounds. A distinctive rumble broke through the quiet as a classic Triumph motorcycle approached the palace gates of Buckingham Palace. The rider, dressed in a simple black jacket and worn jeans, didn't match the typical image of palace visitors. As Keanu Reeves brought his bike to a stop, no one could have predicted the extraordinary events about to unfold at one of Britain's most guarded locations. The Royal Guard, positioned at his post with characteristic stoicism, watched the motorcycle's approach with growing suspicion. His grip tightened on his ceremonial rifle as the rider dismounted, revealing a face known to millions but somehow unrecognizable in this setting. The evening air crackled with tension as the guard's traditional stance shifted ever so slightly, marking the beginning of what would become an unforgettable encounter. Time seemed to freeze as Keanu stepped forward, official invitation in hand. The guard's reaction, wholly unexpected, would soon cascade into a series of events that would challenge not just protocol, but the very notions of judgment and authority within the palace walls. What happened next would leave everyone, from tourists to palace officials, questioning their own preconceptions about fame, humility, and the power of quiet dignity. The evening shadows stretched across London's historic streets as Keanu made his way through the city's winding paths. The autumn air carried a gentle chill, wrapping around him as his Triumph motorcycle purred through the quieting streets. His well-worn leather jacket and faded jeans stood in stark contrast to the opulent surroundings as he approached the palace grounds. Buckingham Palace loomed ahead, its cream-colored walls bathed in the warm glow of sunset. The usual throng of camera-wielding tourists had dwindled to a handful of stragglers, their attention immediately drawn to the unexpected arrival of a motorcycle at such a prestigious location. Keanu had received a personal invitation to attend a private charity event within the palace walls, though his choice of transportation and attire reflected his characteristic modesty rather than the grandeur of the occasion. The palace gates gleamed in the fading light, their ornate metalwork a testament to centuries of royal tradition. 2 royal guards stood at attention, their red uniforms and bearskin caps cutting impressive figures against the darkening sky. The one positioned nearest to the gate entrance watched with increasing interest as Keanu brought his motorcycle to a stop, the engine's rumble echoing off the ancient stonework. Tourists whispered and pointed, their phones raised to capture this unusual scene. Keanu remained unfazed, reaching into his jacket pocket for the formal invitation. The cream-colored envelope bore the royal seal, its contents requesting his presence at an exclusive fundraising event for veterans' mental health services, a cause close to his heart. The nearest guard's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly as Keanu approached. The guard's eyes, barely visible beneath his tall bearskin cap, tracked every movement with growing scrutiny. The contrast between Keanu's casual appearance and the formal grandeur of his surroundings couldn't have been more pronounced. His boots scuffed softly against the cobblestones as he walked toward the gate, invitation held loosely in one hand, helmet tucked under his arm. The setting sun cast long shadows across the palace grounds, creating an almost theatrical backdrop for what was about to unfold. The autumn breeze carried distant sounds of London traffic, a mundane soundtrack to this increasingly tense moment. Several palace staff members visible through the windows had paused in their duties, attention drawn to the unusual sight of a motorcycle-riding visitor at the formal gates. Keanu's calm demeanor remained unchanged as he stopped before the guard. His face, partially hidden by several days' worth of stubble, showed no sign of concern about the growing tension. The guard's ceremonial rifle shifted slightly, a subtle movement that spoke volumes about the uncertainty of the situation. The stage was set for an encounter that would challenge everyone's expectations about appearance, authority, and the true nature of dignity. The royal guard's voice cut through the evening air with crisp authority, demanding Keanu halt his approach. His tone carried the weight of centuries of tradition, each word measured and precise as he addressed the unconventional visitor. The guard's questioning began with standard protocol, but his inflection betrayed an unmistakable note of suspicion. Keanu responded with characteristic tranquility, extending the invitation while maintaining a respectful distance. The cream envelope caught the last rays of sunlight, the royal seal clearly visible against the pale paper. The guard's eyes flickered between the invitation and Keanu's casual attire, his skepticism evident in the slight tightening of his jaw. The gathering crowd of onlookers grew, their phones raised to capture this unusual interaction. Palace staff members had begun to gather at nearby windows, drawn by the mounting tension at the gates. The guard maintained his rigid posture as he examined the invitation, his gloved hands handling the document with barely concealed doubt. Time seemed to slow as the guard methodically inspected every detail of the invitation. His scrutiny intensified with each passing moment, his training warring with the apparent disconnect between the formal document and the man who presented it. The guard's questions became more pointed, each one laden with underlying skepticism about Keanu's presence at such a prestigious location. Keanu stood patiently, his posture relaxed but respectful, as the guard radioed for verification. The evening air grew cooler, but the atmosphere at the gates only heated up. The guard's communication with his superiors carried an edge of certainty that something wasn't quite right. His words clipped and precise as he described the situation. Several minutes passed as the verification process dragged on. The guard's colleague at the opposite gate had shifted slightly, attention drawn to the unfolding scene. Keanu remained still, his calm presence a stark contrast to the growing agitation of the guard. The motorcycle stood silent behind him, its presence seemingly amplifying the guard's doubts about its rider's legitimacy. The guard's questioning took an unexpected turn as he began to focus on Keanu's choice of transportation and attire. His words, though professionally delivered, carried an undercurrent of judgment. The implications were clear. This was not how an invited guest of the palace typically arrived. Keanu's responses remained measured and polite, each word chosen carefully to avoid escalating the situation. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, their whispers creating a low buzz of speculation. Some had begun to recognize the actor, adding another layer of complexity to the already tense situation. The guard, however, remained unmoved by the growing murmurs of recognition from the crowd. His focus stayed locked on what he perceived as an irregularity in palace protocol. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the palace lights began to illuminate the grounds, casting new shadows across the scene. The guard's patience appeared to wear thin with each passing moment, his traditional stoicism giving way to visible frustration. His questions became more direct, bordering on confrontational, as he struggled to reconcile the formal invitation with the casual figure before him. The situation reached a critical point as the guard declared the need for additional verification. His announcement carried a note of finality, suggesting that Keanu's entrance to the palace grounds would be significantly delayed, if permitted at all. The actor's continued composure in the face of this declaration only seemed to fuel the guard's suspicion further. Behind Keanu, the crowd had grown even larger, their presence adding pressure to an already charged atmosphere. Palace staff members were now openly watching from windows and doorways, their usual discretion forgotten in the face of this unusual confrontation. The guard's colleague had taken several steps closer, ready to provide support if needed. Keanu's response to this escalation remained characteristically graceful. His voice stayed steady as he agreed to whatever additional verification the guard deemed necessary. This compliance, delivered with such genuine patience, seemed to momentarily unsettle the guard, whose training hadn't prepared him for such a response from someone he clearly viewed with suspicion. The first hints of twilight touched the palace walls as this initial encounter drew to its uncertain conclusion. The guard's final words carried both authority and warning, a clear indication that the situation was far from resolved. Keanu's quiet acceptance of these terms, coupled with his unwavering calm, set the stage for what would become an even more remarkable sequence of events. The guard's initial skepticism transformed into open hostility as the verification process stretched into its second hour. The palace grounds had grown darker, the ornate lampposts casting dramatic shadows across the cobblestones. Keanu remained at his position near the motorcycle, his patience unwavering despite the increasingly hostile atmosphere. Several senior palace security officers had arrived at the scene, their presence adding another layer of complexity to the situation. Each new arrival studied the invitation with growing intensity, their hushed conversations punctuated by skeptical glances toward Keanu. The original guard maintained his post, but had adopted an air of smug satisfaction as his superiors seemed to share his doubts. The crowd of onlookers had swelled considerably, their phones illuminating the growing darkness like fireflies. Social media buzzed with activity as photos and videos of the scene spread across the internet. The guard's awareness of this attention appeared to strengthen his resolve, his posture becoming even more rigid as he enforced what he perceived as proper protocol. A palace administrator emerged from a side entrance, document folder in hand. His approach was measured, careful, as he navigated the growing tension. The guard straightened further, if such a thing were possible, preparing to present his case against allowing this unconventional visitor entry. The administrator's expression remained neutral as he reviewed both the invitation and the growing file of security concerns. Keanu's motorcycle had become a point of particular contention. The guard repeatedly referenced it as evidence of inappropriate conduct, his tone growing more condescending with each mention. The beautiful Triumph, which had drawn admiring glances earlier, now stood as a symbol of everything the guard found suspicious about this situation. The evening air had grown notably colder, but Keanu showed no signs of discomfort. His continued composure seemed to frustrate the guard even further, who clearly expected, perhaps even hoped for, some display of anger or impatience. Instead, Keanu's quiet dignity only highlighted the growing unreasonableness of the situation. More palace staff had gathered at various vantage points, their usual duties forgotten as they watched the scene unfold. The guard's colleagues had begun to shift uncomfortably, perhaps sensing that this situation had escalated beyond reasonable protocol. Yet the original guard remained unmoved, his judgment apparently reinforced by each passing moment. The administrator's questions became more detailed, though his tone carried none of the guard's obvious prejudice. Keanu answered each inquiry with the same patient clarity he had shown from the beginning. His responses, though perfectly reasonable, seemed to only fuel the guard's conviction that something was amiss. A sleek official car pulled up to the gates, its arrival drawing all eyes momentarily away from the main confrontation. The guard's posture shifted subtly, anticipating support for his position from whoever emerged from the vehicle. The tension in the air reached a new peak as everyone waited to see how this new development would affect the situation. Tourists continued to gather, their numbers now significant enough to attract the attention of local police. Two officers approached on foot, their presence adding yet another layer of authority to the scene. The guard acknowledged them with a curt nod, clearly viewing their arrival as validation of his concerns. The palace lights had fully illuminated the grounds by now, creating an almost theatrical setting for this continuing drama. Keanu stood in a pool of light, his calm demeanor unchanged despite the growing circus around him. The guard's shadow stretched long across the cobblestones, his authority seemingly amplified by the dramatic lighting. Whispers spread through the crowd as more people recognized the actor, creating a ripple effect of murmurs and pointed fingers. The guard remained steadfast in his position, perhaps the only person present who either didn't recognize Keanu or chose not to acknowledge his celebrity status. His dedication to what he perceived as proper protocol had become almost obsessive. The administrator's phone rang, breaking the tension momentarily. His conversation, though quiet, carried enough authority to draw everyone's attention. The guard watched intently, his expression suggesting he anticipated final confirmation of his suspicions. Keanu waited patiently, his posture relaxed but dignified, as yet another layer of verification began. The guard's patience finally snapped as the administrator ended his phone call. His voice rose sharply across the palace grounds, abandoning all pretense of ceremonial stoicism. The accusation rang out clear in the evening air. This must be an elaborate attempt to breach palace security, he declared, gesturing at Keanu's motorcycle and casual attire as if they were evidence of criminal intent. Tension crackled through the gathered crowd as the guard stepped forward, his ceremonial rifle shifting to a more aggressive position. The administrator attempted to interject, but the guard pressed on, his words tumbling out in a torrent of assumptions and prejudices. He proclaimed that no legitimate guest would arrive at Buckingham Palace on a motorcycle, dressed like a common tourist, expecting entry to a royal function. Keanu's response came quietly, each word measured and calm despite the guard's increasing hostility. He explained that the motorcycle was his preferred mode of transportation, and his clothing choice reflected his personal values rather than any disrespect for the palace or its traditions. The guard scoffed audibly, his dismissal of these explanations evident in every movement of his rigid posture. The situation escalated further as additional palace security personnel converged on the scene. The guard, perhaps emboldened by their presence, launched into a detailed critique of everything he found suspicious about Keanu's appearance and behavior. His voice carried across the grounds, drawing more onlookers and causing several palace staff members to exchange worried glances. The administrator's attempts to regain control of the situation were repeatedly interrupted by the guard's increasingly passionate declarations. He insisted that allowing such a casually dressed individual into the palace would set a dangerous precedent, undermining centuries of protocol and tradition. His colleagues shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing that the situation had spiraled beyond reasonable security concerns. Keanu remained motionless throughout this tirade, his calm presence creating a stark contrast to the guard's growing agitation. The evening lights cast dramatic shadows across his face as he listened, showing no sign of anger or frustration. This composed reaction seemed to further infuriate the guard, who interpreted it as additional evidence of suspicious behavior. The crowd had grown significantly, their phones capturing every moment of this unprecedented confrontation. Social media exploded with real-time updates, drawing even more attention to the unfolding drama. The guard, aware of the audience but beyond caring, continued his verbal assault on Keanu's character and intentions. A senior palace official emerged from the main entrance, his hurried approach suggesting awareness of the situation's gravity. The guard, however, was too invested in his accusations to notice this new arrival. He proceeded to demand that Keanu remove himself from palace grounds immediately, his voice carrying an authority he didn't actually possess. The atmosphere grew even tenser as the guard made a move toward Keanu's motorcycle, declaring his intention to have it removed as a security threat. This action finally prompted a response from Keanu, who stepped forward with quiet authority, placing himself between the guard and his bike. The crowd gasped collectively, sensing the potential for physical confrontation. The senior official's voice cut through the tension like a knife, halting the guard mid-stride. His commanding presence demanded immediate attention, but the guard, caught up in his own righteousness, attempted to justify his actions. His words tumbled out in a desperate attempt to maintain control of a situation that had clearly escaped his grasp. Keanu's voice, when it finally rose above the guard's protests, carried a weight that silenced everyone present. He addressed not just the guard but all those gathered, speaking about judgment, appearances, and the dangers of allowing preconceptions to cloud our treatment of others. The guard's face, visible beneath his bearskin cap, showed the first signs of uncertainty. The senior official moved closer, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and concern. The guard's colleagues had begun to distance themselves slightly, their body language suggesting growing awareness of the situation's impropriety. The administrator clutched his folder tightly, his discomfort with the entire scene evident in every movement. The guard made one final attempt to assert his authority, but his words lacked their earlier conviction. The crowd's murmurs had grown louder, many now openly discussing the guard's behavior rather than Keanu's presence. The palace lights seemed to grow brighter, illuminating a scene that would soon become a lesson in humility and prejudice. The senior palace official's next words shattered the tension with devastating clarity. He addressed the guard first, his tone carrying both authority and disappointment. This was Keanu Reeves, he explained, not only an invited guest, but the evening's guest of honor at the Veterans Mental Health fundraiser. The guard's face drained of color as recognition finally dawned, his ceremonial rifle lowering slightly as the weight of his actions settled upon him. The official turned to Keanu, extending both an apology and his hand. The actor's presence had been eagerly anticipated, he explained, as Keanu's substantial private donations to veterans' causes had inspired this evening's event. The guard's rigid posture crumbled slightly as each word drove home the magnitude of his misjudgment. A ripple of understanding moved through the gathered crowd. Several palace staff members stepped forward, their faces showing a mixture of recognition and embarrassment. The administrator quickly flipped through his documents, producing the guest list with Keanu's name prominently displayed at the top. The guard's colleagues exchanged glances, their earlier discomfort now transformed into obvious dismay. The senior official continued his explanation, revealing that Keanu's choice of transportation and attire had been known and accommodated in advance. The motorcycle would be securely stored within the palace grounds, a detail the guard had never allowed to be explained. Each revelation seemed to physically impact the guard, whose ceremonial stance had given way to visible discomfort. Keanu's response to this revelation remained characteristically gracious. He spoke quietly with the senior official, expressing understanding for security protocols, while gently highlighting how prejudice had transformed reasonable caution into unreasonable judgment. The guard stood motionless, forced to witness this exchange that so clearly demonstrated the dignity he had failed to recognize. The administrator stepped forward, presenting documentation that showed every aspect of Keanu's arrival had been properly arranged. The guard's earlier certainty crumbled entirely as he realized how his assumptions had blinded him to the truth. His colleagues had begun to process arriving guests through another entrance, their efficiency highlighting how much time had been wasted by prejudice. The gathering crowd watched as palace staff quickly mobilized to correct the situation. The senior official's phone buzzed continuously as news of the incident spread through palace channels. Keanu remained calm throughout, his demeanor unchanged by the revelation of his status or the guard's evident distress. More palace officials arrived, their presence highlighting the significance of the evening's event and, by extension, the gravity of the guard's error. Each new arrival seemed to carry another piece of evidence, showing how thoroughly planned and approved Keanu's visit had been. The guard's earlier suspicions now appeared not just misguided, but actively harmful to palace operations. The senior official began coordinating with staff to expedite Keanu's entry while maintaining security protocols. The actor's patience remained steadfast as proper procedures were finally followed, his earlier attempts to explain himself now validated by official documentation. The guard watched this process unfold, his previous authority diminished by his demonstrated lack of judgment. As the revelation settled over the gathered crowd, phones captured this final phase of the encounter. The contrast between Keanu's composed acceptance of the situation and the guard's visible discomfort created a powerful image. The palace lights illuminated a scene that had transformed from confrontation to correction, from suspicion to understanding. The senior palace official guided Keanu and the guard to a private alcove near the gates, away from the watching crowd. The moment called for resolution, not public spectacle. Keanu initiated the conversation, addressing the guard with the same patience he had shown throughout the encounter. His words focused not on the guard's mistakes, but on the broader lesson about judgment and perception. The guard struggled to maintain his composure as Keanu spoke about his own experiences with prejudice, sharing stories of times when his simple lifestyle had led others to make incorrect assumptions. The actor explained how he chose to live according to his values rather than others' expectations, whether riding his motorcycle to a royal event or wearing comfortable clothes that some might consider too casual. The official watched as understanding gradually replaced embarrassment in the guard's expression. Keanu's words carried no accusation, only wisdom gained from similar encounters throughout his life. He spoke about the importance of looking beyond surface appearances, acknowledging that while protocol and security were crucial, they should never become excuses for prejudice. The guard finally found his voice, offering a sincere apology that revealed how deeply the evening's events had affected him. He admitted that his dedication to protocol had become entangled with personal biases he hadn't recognized until this moment. The guard's words, though halting, showed genuine reflection on how quickly judgment could cloud reasonable caution. Keanu accepted the apology with characteristic grace, suggesting that the evening's events could serve as a valuable lesson for everyone involved. He spoke about how true security came not just from following protocols, but from approaching each situation with clear eyes and an open mind. The guard nodded in agreement, his earlier hostility completely transformed into respectful attention. The senior official then outlined changes that would be implemented in security training, using this incident as an example of how unconscious bias could interfere with proper procedure. Keanu offered to contribute his perspective to these training sessions, turning a potentially damaging incident into an opportunity for positive change. As they prepared to conclude this private conversation, the guard surprised everyone by sharing a personal reflection. He spoke about how his years of service had gradually narrowed his vision of what belonged at the palace, causing him to forget that dignity came in many forms. Keanu's response was simply to offer his hand, a gesture that transformed the evening from confrontation to connection. The official noted that while protocols would remain strict, this incident would remind all palace staff that judgment should be based on facts rather than appearances. The guard's colleagues, watching from a respectful distance, could see the visible change in their fellow officers' demeanor, a transformation that spoke louder than any formal reprimand could have. The palace lights cast a warm glow across the courtyard as Keanu prepared to enter the charity event. His motorcycle had been carefully parked in a designated area, a small victory for breaking traditional expectations. The guard, transformed by the evening's events, stood at his post with a noticeably different demeanor, his rigid formality now balanced with authentic awareness. Guests arriving in luxury cars watched with interest as Keanu removed his leather jacket, revealing a simple but elegant shirt beneath. The guard observed these arrivals too, but his perspective had shifted. Each guest now represented an individual to be respected rather than an appearance to be judged, a lesson learned through humility and wisdom. The senior official accompanied Keanu to the palace entrance, their conversation touching on the evening's impact. Palace staff members nodded respectfully as they passed, their attitudes reflecting a new understanding of how true dignity transcends outer appearances. The guard caught Keanu's eye one final time, exchanging a look that acknowledged their shared experience. Inside the palace, the Veterans Mental Health fundraiser buzzed with activity. Stories of the gate incident had already circulated, but Keanu's graceful handling of the situation only enhanced the evening's purpose. His presence reminded everyone that compassion and understanding were values that belonged in every setting, from palace gates to charity events. As the night drew to a close, the guard watched Keanu depart on his motorcycle, the engine's rumble echoing off the palace walls. The sound carried with it a reminder that assumptions and prejudices often blind us to the truth of who people really are. The guard stood straighter at his post, not from rigid protocol, but from a newfound understanding of what true dignity meant. The next morning's shift change brought questions from curious colleagues, but the guard's responses focused on the lessons learned rather than the confrontation itself. His story became part of palace security training, a powerful reminder that even the most dedicated protectors must guard against their own prejudices. Keanu's motorcycle helmet and leather jacket had challenged palace traditions, but his patience and dignity had transformed a potential conflict into a moment of growth. The guard's post remained the same, but his perspective had changed forever, proof that sometimes the most valuable lessons come from the most unexpected teachers.